Welcome to the second tutorial. Today we'll be talking about remote SSH with VS Code. So this tutorial is broken up into three different parts. The first two parts are really just talking about general principles that apply to any sort of remote server. So I'll be using the Zion cluster as a concrete example, but you can connect to another remote server if you'd like to. If you want to connect to the Zion server as well, make sure that you have a username and a password. Otherwise, you won't really be able to follow along. So part one is just all about logging in. So we're going to create an SSH connection from our laptop to some sort of remote server. And in part two, we're going to make this passwordless so that we don't have to enter in our password every single time. To do this, we're going to generate a public and private key, and then we're going to copy the public key to the remote server. By doing this, we won't have to enter in our password every single time because SSH will just automatically authenticate us in the background using these keys. And the third part really only applies to the Zion cluster. So if you've been using some other remote server, you won't really be able to follow along with this part. But by part three, we've really connected to Z5 using an SSH connection. And we've made the process passwordless by generating public and private keys. And we want to be able to connect to all the other nodes in the cluster. Now, we can't generate a direct connection to each one of these nodes. And so what we're going to do is use Z5 as a login node. And we're going to proxy jump to each one of these nodes. And then after we've done that, we want to make this passwordless as well. So we're going to copy that public key that we generated on our laptop to each one of the nodes. And after we've done all this, we'll be able to successfully navigate from one host to another. So the first thing we want to do in part one is just connect to a remote server. And we're going to click on this little extensions tab right here. And we need to download the remote SSH connection. So let's go remote SSH and click on that. And then we're going to click install. And this will just take a second. It's pretty fast. Okay, and as soon as you've done that, you'll notice that down here in your bottom left-hand corner, there's a little green button now. So let's click on that. And there's a lot of different options here. We're just going to open the SSH configuration file. So click on that. And I'm just going to click on this top one right here, which is the configuration file for my particular user. All right, so this is an empty configuration file. You might already have configurations in here if you had this file previously. But for me, this is just kind of like the auto-generated stuff. So here, I'm just going to get rid of this line up here. And then let's kind of talk about each part of this. So host, you just put like an alias, like kind of a nickname for this connection right here. And then the host name is actually going to be the IP address to the host you want to connect to. User is going to be the username. And eventually, we're also going to add a port. So host, since I'm connecting to the Zion cluster, I'm going to say Z5 because that's the login node and that's the one that I'm first going to connect to. And the host name, I don't know off the top of my head. So I'm going to jump to my browser right here. And I kind of have a cheat sheet. I have the Zion cluster guide up and ready to go. And so these are all kind of like the private IP addresses. So these aren't really what we want. Instead, I'm going to come down here. And this is the IP address. This is the public facing IP address to connect to the Zion cluster. So I'm going to copy that. And then I'm going to jump back to my configuration file, and I'm just going to paste it in right here. And my username is mspataro on the Zion cluster. And make sure that you have an account set up on the Zion cluster before you try to follow along with this as well. And then the port, if we look back at that cheat sheet, you'll see that we normally specify the port to be 220. And so we're going to put that right here, 220. Perfect. And we have everything set up and it should be good to go. So now I'm just going to click on this little button again. And I'm going to click on connect current window to host. Well, actually, let's talk about this. So there's two different options here. There's connect to host, which will open up a separate window. And then there's connect current window to host, which will kind of refresh the page that you're currently on and connect it to the host. So I'm actually going to choose the first option, which will create a new window. So I'm going to do that. And here's all my different options in my configuration file. Right now, I only have Z5. So I'll just click on that one right there. And as I said, here's a new window that's popping up. And I'll just make this full screen. It's going to, first I just need to say continue because this is the first time I've connected. So I'm going to say continue here, and then you will need to enter in your password. So I'm going to do that now. If this is the first time that you're logging into the Design cluster, you're going to want to enter in your default password. And then at some point, you're going to want to change it to a more memorable password that's unique to you. Okay, so now you can see in our terminal window, we have successfully connected to the Design cluster. We're on Z5, which is awesome. And so at this point, now we're going to move into part 2. And part 2 is to make this process passwordless. And the reason that we might want to do this is that anytime we refresh this window, it's going to ask us for the password. So I'll kind of give you an example. If I click this button again and I say connect to host, and I say Z5, and this opened up another window, it will ask for the password. And that just kind of gets obnoxious after a while. So we're going to jump back. Remember, I have 2 windows here because I opened a new one when I connected to the Design cluster. So I'm going to jump back to the original one that kind of has the configuration file. And down here in this terminal, this is just Windows PowerShell, but it's going to be like your default shell, depending on your operating system. And so I'm just in my home directory right now. If I say list, I can see all the different directories and files here. And you can see that right now I have a .ssh file. This is where we kind of store all the configurations and everything. So let's kind of look at that. I'm going to go cd.ssh. And you can see that we have our configuration file, which we kind of just created, and then known hosts that we've connected to. But what we want to do is we want to kind of generate these public and private keys that I was talking about earlier. So I'm going to say SSH keygen, and that's it. You can specify other parameters to kind of specify like what algorithm you want to generate the keys. But if we just do this, it will be the default RSA key. So I'm going to do that. You can see that it's generating a public and private RSA key pair. And I'm just going to press enter so that it generates it and saves it in the default location. I'm going to press enter for no passphrase. Perfect. And so now that we've done that, when I do ls, we should see 2 new files here. So ID_RSA and ID_RSA.pub. So this is our private key, and the .pub is the public key. And so make sure that you keep this private key safe. You never really want to reveal it or copy it anywhere else, because otherwise you're not safe. You've kind of been compromised. But the public key, that's what we're going to be copying to the Design cluster. So let's take a look at that. If I say cat ID RSA .pub, whoops. So here is my public key, and it's the entire thing, not just like these random letters and numbers. So copy just from the very beginning where it says SSH-RSA. I'm going to copy this. Perfect. And then I'm going to jump back to my other tab where I'm connected to the Design cluster. So here I am. Here's my home directory on the Design cluster. And first, let's check to see if I have an SSH directory. So I can go ls-a, and that will show all the hidden directories. And yeah, we can see that I already do have a .ssh directory. If you don't have one, what you can do is you can just say make dir for make directory. And then if you say -p, that'll make sure that if you do have one, it won't like give you an error. So this is kind of like the safest way to create a directory. And then I'm going to say .ssh, and that will create a directory if you didn't already have one. Okay, so now that we've done that, I'm going to cd into .ssh. Oops. Okay. And what we're going to do is we're going to put that public key in the authorized keys. So I'm going to say echo, and then I'm just going to paste. I'm going to do Control-Shift-V, and that's just pasting that public key that I got from my personal laptop. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, I'm going to redirect it. And so I'm going to use these greater than signs, and notice that I do 2 of them. If I do 1, it's going to overwrite the entire file that I'm redirecting to. And if I do 2, then it will append to what's already there. So potentially, if you already have like some authorized keys, you wouldn't want to just completely overwrite the entire file. So make sure that you do 2. And then what we're going to say is authorized, and I'm just going to press tab to autocomplete authorized keys. Okay, so I'm going to do that, press enter. And now that I did that, if I say like cat authorized keys, here are all the authorized keys, and you'll notice this bottom one right here is our most recent public key that we just appended to the file. And yeah, I have a lot of different keys. Yours probably won't be quite this full. Okay, so now that we've done that, we should be able to connect without a password. And so let's test this out. I'm going to now close this window. And then I'm going to click on this remote SSH button again. And if I say connect to host, that'll open up a new window. That's what I want. And then I'm going to say Z5. So here we have our new window. Perfect. And notice that I didn't have to enter in my password. So completely passwordless. Perfect. So that is everything that we need for part 2. So in part 3, what we're going to do is we're going to try to connect to all the other nodes. And remember, we can't really create like a direct connection to those nodes. We have to go through Z5 to do that. So let's start by jumping back to that other tab where I'm just on my local laptop. And here I have my SSH configuration file. And we're just going to generate a bunch of new hosts. So I'm going to copy this. And I'm going to say host Z1. And let's take a look at my cheat sheet. I don't actually remember the host name for Z1. So let's go back to that. And in this case, we're actually going to use these private IP addresses, because once we've kind of connected to Z5, which is our login node, then these are kind of visible to us. We can navigate to one of these IP addresses. So for Z1, it's going to be 192.168.1.4. And one thing I want you to notice here while we're looking at this table is that all of these IP addresses are very similar. So like these first 3 little groups of numbers are all the same for each one of these private addresses. It's always 192.168.1. And then it's just this last number that changes. So you have 4, 5, here, let me spread this out a little bit more, maybe 20, 13, 3, and 17. So that makes it a little bit easier for us to remember. Okay, so let's jump back now. And so let's see if I can remember. 192.168.1.4 is going to be Z1. And once we've already made it past the login node, which is Z5, we don't need to connect with this port. So I'm going to get rid of this. But what we will need to do is we'll need to say proxy jump. And proxy jump, we just put the name of the host that is basically the login node. So I'm just going to put Z5. And then the configuration file will know to look kind of at this little configuration. And first, kind of enter through this, and then to try to enter this host, essentially. Okay, so once we've done that with Z1, let's do that with the others. So we have Z1, we have Z2, and all we need to change is just do 0.5 here. And now let's do Z3. And we're just going to change this last number to 20. And then Z4, whoops. I believe that's 13. We don't need to do Z5 again, but if we want, we can do Z6. I think that's 17. Okay. So there we go. Make sure that you have all of those different configurations. And remember, for anything that's not Z5, you're going to want this proxy jump command, because this will essentially tell it to first go through Z5 and then to connect to the host that you really want to connect to. Let's just double check that I had all those right. So I did 4, 5, 20, 13, 17. 4, 5, 20, 13, 17. And notice I just skipped over the Z5 local address because we can just put the public facing one. Okay, great. So now that we've done that, let's try to connect to one of these. So I'm going to open up a new window. So I'm going to say connect to host. And here are all my different options now. Let's just try to do Z1. So I'm going to click on Z1. And it's first going to go through Z5, which it's already done. And now it's asking for my password for Z1. So I have to enter that in. Okay. And you can see that we were able to successfully connect here, which is pretty cool. So I'm going to close this window since now we have like 3 different tabs and that's a little bit confusing. And now what we want to do is make all of these nodes that we just added passwordless as well, so that we don't even have to enter our password in, like when we're, say, connecting to Z1. So in order to do this, we need to copy that same public key from like your local laptop to each one of those nodes. So I'm just going to use the cat command to kind of see what that is again. So remember this, I'm on my local computer in my SSH directory, and I want to look at my public key. So I'm going to say cat id rsa.pub. Perfect. And I'm going to copy the entire thing. I'm going to say Control-Shift-C to copy that. And then I'm going to jump back to the other window. And remember, this is where I'm connected to Z5. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put this public key in a file called key. And this is just kind of to make things more convenient. You'll kind of see why this will be helpful in a second. So to do this, I'm going to say echo, and then I'm going to paste all of this. And then I'm going to use a little bit of file redirection, kind of like how I did before. But this time I'm just going to use a single one because if the file already exists, it's okay if I overwrite it. And I'm just going to call the file key. And after I've done that, you should see a new file called key. And if I cat key, there's my public key. Perfect. Okay. And so what we want to do is copy this file over to every other node. And so let's just start with Z1. So in order to do this, I'm first going to kind of like paste the contents of my key file. To do that, I'm going to say cat key. And stick with me here. It might get a little bit confusing, but I'll kind of explain it after I maybe write everything out. So then what I'm going to do after I've done cat key is I'm going to pipe that. I'm going to say SSH, and I'm going to say 192.168.1.4. So this is connecting us to Z1. And then I'm going to have quotation marks, and I can put in a command that will then be run on that remote host that I just connected to with this SSH connection. So I'm going to then say cat, and I'm going to direct that into a file called key. And then I'm just going to do a semicolon to do a new command. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that I have a directory there, an SSH directory. So I'm going to say make dir -p. And remember, the -p just means that if the directory already exists, then it won't give me an error. It'll just keep on going. So that's perfect. And so I'll say make dir -p .ssh. And then the last thing that we want to do is say cat key and redirect that to .ssh slash known, no, not known hosts. Oh, is it authorized keys? I believe that's right. Okay. And so once we do all of that, press enter in the password. and it should have worked. Okay, so now that we've done it on one node, Z1, we need to do it on the others. So I'm just going to kind of go through, and all I'm going to do is just replace this single digit with a 5, and this is for Z2. I'll have to enter my password again here. Uh-oh. So one of the weird things about VS Code that you have to be aware of is that sometimes the terminal kind of bugs out. So in this case, it like inserted the character in the wrong place. So let's get rid of that. And then we'll just do 5 here. And one of the ways to check that I check that the command is actually what I think it is I'll just press up to go to the previous command and then down to go to the current command. And so it looks pretty good here. I'm just going to put that space back just in case. Okay, so let's do that. That's for Z2. Okay, so now let's do Z3. So that will be 20. Okay, and I'm going to press enter here. All right, now let's do Z4. And that's going to be 13. Okay. And then last of all, we'll do Z6. And so this is 17, I believe. Oh yeah, and it looks like Z6 is down right now, so I won't actually be able to show you that. But when you do it, it will probably work. For whatever reason, Z6 just isn't working right now. Okay, so now that we've done all of that, we've copied the public key to each one of those nodes. There's one last thing we need to add to make this work. So let's come back here, and we're going to add a new command here called identity file. And right here, we're just going to put the path to our private key stored on our local laptop. So let's take a look here. Here I am on my local computer. And if I say pwd to print the working directory, this is what it gives me. And so I'm going to copy this here. And then I'm going to say /id _ RSA. And let's make sure that that's correct. Yep, that's the name of the private key file. And so then I'm just going to copy this one line to all the other host configurations. I don't actually have to add it to Z5, so I'll be okay not doing that. Okay, and so once I've done this, I'm going to save this configuration file, and now let's try to log into one of these remote hosts. So I'm going to say connect to host, and then let's say Z1 again. Okay, and as you can see, we didn't have to enter in the password, which is awesome. So now you can navigate between any host that you want. You can just seamlessly switch. So I can say like connect current window to host and just pick any one of these here. I'm going to go to Z3 now, and it should just work. And this makes it super convenient whenever you're doing kind of work between nodes. The first time that you connect, you'll have to like click continue like this. But yeah, that's all there is to it. So I'll make sure to put a link to this kind of cheat sheet with all the IP addresses. I'll put a link to this in the description so that you can take a look at this as well when you're going through this. There's one last thing I can mention here, and this is kind of a new feature that was barely just added on today. So maybe they'll kind of introduce this in later years too. So there's this external SSH port, and this allows you to kind of create a direct connection to like these other nodes. So you can create a direct connection to Z1 or a Z3. And the way you would do that is if you go back to your configuration file, instead of having that private IP address, you'll grab that public one again. And then what you'll say is you'll just add the port and you're going to put that external port. So for example, I could do like 219. And I could do the same thing with Z3. So Z3, I could just paste this in right here and I could say port, and I believe it was like 221. And if you do this, then make sure that you get rid of the proxy jump as well. This is kind of like an alternative method. So instead of like going through Z5 and then to that node, now we have a direct connection from our laptop to that node. And that's because there's this public, public port, external SSH port. Okay, so now that I save this, let's just make sure that that really works how we think. I can say connect to host, and then Z1. And this should just work in the same way as before. And because I copied that public key, it will still be passwordless, even though we kind of like configured it in a slightly different way, which is really cool. Sweet. Well, that's all there is to it. And I will see you in the next tutorial. Thanks for watching.